All right, let's dive in. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this month's CEBRA webinar, or CEBRAnar as they're commonly known. My name's Julia Wells. I'm the Assistant Secretary here at the Department of Agriculture in our Biosecurity Strategy area, and we oversee the CEBRA relationship. So firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land that I'm meeting on today here in the ACT, and recognise other people or families with connection to these lands. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture, the contribution they make to the life of this city and region, and I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all the other lands on which our attendees are gathered today, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today's webinar. Today's session will be recorded and it will be available on CEBRA's YouTube channel, so you can catch up or refer it to friends. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation as well, so please feel free during that time to put up your hand or to pop a question into the chat panel. So for any newcomers, a tiny bit of background. So the Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, or CEBRA, it's a long-standing biosecurity research initiative. In fact, it's coming up to its 20-year anniversary this year, hosted by the University of Melbourne. CEBRA provides the Australian and New Zealand governments with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform our biosecurity risk management activities. So today we are lucky enough to hear about the Strategic Program for Applied Research Coordination, or SPARC, and we welcome Professor Andrew Robertson, who's the CEO of CEBRA. He'll explore the challenges of applied research, where outcomes are inherently uncertain, but there's an expectation for delivering actionable outcomes. And he's going to bring this to life for us today through a case study. Andrew is a regular presenter at CEBRAnar, and as the CEO of CEBRA, leads a distinguished cohort of researchers that undertake critical research in the biosecurity risk analysis space. He has let us know that he's looking forward to your robust questions and discussion today, so I hope everyone's ready to jump in and engage. So please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Thanks very much, Julia. I'm going to obviously share my screen and hopefully put a presentation, so I'll look to you, Julia, to let me know if I'm doing that correctly. It's going to take a moment. While I'm fiddling with this, I'm also going to comment that this presentation sort of derives from some challenges that I've had over the past couple of years. Let's see if I share this window. Am I sharing my presentation? I can't hear anyone.
Yep, no, looks good. Thank you, Andrew.
Great, thanks. So as an aging academic, I occasionally receive invitations to review research projects and research programs. This is a necessary step. You know, the scientific sort of culture demands that we check everything we can, check it twice or check it 3 times and cut once. And as I've been invited to undertake these reviews, I've found myself increasingly dissatisfied with the state of the kinds of tools that we can bring to bear to transparently and fairly review these programs. I've found myself somewhat flummoxed in thinking about, well, researcher A wants to do things X, Y, and Z, and they're pretty convinced that those are good things to do, and, bully for them, I say. And then researcher B thinks that E, G, and H would be just marvelous crumbs. And I am not entirely sure what are the grounds by which we can reasonably tease these apart. And so I've got this presentation which tries to tackle that challenge in a quite a high level way. And I thought every good presentation needs to have a catchy acronym. So of course I went on ChatGPT and started digging for sexy acronyms, and this is the best I could do. I'm so sorry, SPARC. And I'm using it despite my distaste for it. But I've coined a new one for our entertainment, and that is that SPARC is a UPA. And UPA stands for Uncomfortably Procrustean Acronym. And those of you who have a mind for the classics may recall that Procrustes was a Greek king, I think, or some kind of person who would, in order to be sure that his guests fit into the accommodation he planned for them, chop off their legs and arms as necessary in order to make sure that they fit. So A Procrustean argument is one that chops off unnecessary things in order to fit, and a Procrustean algorithm is one that, let's say, bends everything necessary in order to sound good. So, welcome to SPARC. I have further context to talk about. This is a very brief overview of our trajectory. I'm going to talk about models to start with, and then I'm going to talk about, provide a case study example, and then I'll finally talk about SPARC, this idea that's been kicking around in my head, perhaps echoing somewhat, certainly clanging. Now, I want to start now by just tracing a little bit of my thinking back. Many of you will be familiar with this graphic. It's a summary of the CEBRA value model outputs from several years ago. The value model applied to the Australian biosecurity system estimates the value of the biosecurity system, and it does so using a simulation model. First order, let's say, simple, let's say, approximation, let's say, of the Australian biosecurity system. You spin the model up and you switch the biosecurity system on, you run the model, and then you spin the model up, you switch the biosecurity system off, and you run the model, you compare these two things, and that tells you the value of the biosecurity system. So in each scenario, you're estimating the loss that occurs as a consequence of invasive species. And you compare the loss with the system on and the loss with the system off, and it's great. Very informative. Now, the thing is, though, I was thinking about the model not just as a collection of its outputs, but actually as a model. And I came to this rather unsettling realization that the model itself is an ontology. I'm going to talk more about what that means later on, but I just want to say that this created this terrifying, uncomfortable nexus between several CEBRA projects that heretofore had been developing quietly, independently. And this dragged these two CEBRA projects for me. They dragged them into the same room and almost had a little conceptual cage fight. There are consequences for thinking about models as ontologies, and I'm going to unpack those consequences throughout this presentation. But so I want to say this is quite. It seems trivial, but it's actually quite material, and I'm going to go on about that. In fact, I'm going to go on and on about that. Okay, so let's talk about models. The context is we're in a situation. Let's imagine ourselves into a situation where we have to make decisions about systems. And the kinds of decisions that we have to make are how should we engage with the system as we understand it to be? Now, what I mean by that is when I say engage, I mean manage. Okay, so how do we make decisions in the context of how we think the world might change or the system might change based on our inputs? So essentially, we're thinking about counterfactual scenarios that the system might change into, and we're thinking, well, which ones do we want and how do we get the system there? All of this involves thinking about the system in a sort of systematic way, dare I say it. That's the first one. Secondly, what about how is the system likely to change in the future, and how should we plan for that? How should we think about different ways of engaging with the system that might be better or worse for it or for the system outcomes going forward? Not the system as it is, but as the system as it will be. And thirdly, this is the sort of economical question, how do we invest our limited resources to get the best outcome, however we want to define that, from the system? So these, I want to suggest, these are sort of motivating questions that managers of systems are confronted with continuously. And I further then want to suggest that we could really clamp a nice metric around these motivations, these decisions, by using models. And that's where we're coming back now to the review of research, etc. Is we're going to use models to think about. I'm going to use models to think about that. So, and I hope that at least a small fraction of the folks in the audience are old enough to recognise the image on the right. Apologies if you're not. I'm not going to explain it to you. I want to claim that all of these things that we think about will go better with models. Models, I want to claim, help us organize our thinking about a system. They make the scope of the system or the scope of the system as we choose to see it explicit. Models facilitate communication among stakeholders. Models empower us to think about counterfactuals in a disciplined way and to indeed assess counterfactuals in a disciplined way. And models provide us with making explicit claims about the system. I mean, this is really coming back to the value model, pardon me, analogy, is that what I realized that the value model was actually making claims about how the system worked and putting those claims together, lots of little claims, putting those little claims together to come up with a big claim, which is, this is what's going to happen if we do things X, Y, or Z in the system about which the model was representing. So models will help us do these challenging things. I'm going to provide examples, I promise. So I want to start with our experience in terms of thinking about systems, dare I say, systematically. We've undertaken a considerable number of structured expert judgment exercises over the past decade in CEBRA. And one of the things I've noticed is that almost invariably, these exercise involves confronting experts with many detailed questions that require a burdensome and effortful consideration and thinking and meditation and communication, sometimes arguments. And at the end of this questioning process, when we're frankly exhausted because we've been asking all these questions and writing down all these pieces of information, the experts, although fatigued, they're quite upbeat about the whole thing. They feel cleansed, refreshed, relieved. And I've been trying to think about what it is that experts enjoy about the structured expert judgment process, apart from the immeasurable charm of our facilitators. And I have been suspecting that what the experts enjoy doing is talking often across very diverse lines, talking with a common vocabulary and about things with a common understanding that are captured and codified by the model that they agree to work within. And we found that even people whom we might consider to have quite diverse views on how the world should be can nonetheless use a model as a piece of stable common ground to find and delineate and then discuss points of difference in a relatively dispassionate way. And this has been a really intriguing, almost therapeutic experience for us and for the experts, is to think about systems that would otherwise be too complicated to discuss transparently, honestly, authentically, put them into a model, and then that in a way that provides access. So when we go through this structured expert judgment process, it's explicitly part of that process is to name the things that we're talking about and to articulate how they relate to one another. And that creates a common vocabulary, a common viewpoint, a common model that allows the expressing of disagreements in a way that doesn't underpin or undermine values, but rather say, oh, you see differently than I do in this scenario. And we can now say, well, not you're an idiot, but oh, I see that you see differently. It also gives those experts a chance to speak their truth in a framework that allows them to be heard and to hear other people's truths. So without wanting to stretch this too far, although I fear I may have already fallen over that cliff, I claim that our experience of structured expert judgment and the use of models in structured expert judgment informs the idea that using models helps us think and communicate more crisply with other people. And here's an example of a sketch of such a model on the right-hand side. We've got pathways where biosecurity risk might be entering. We've got measures that might be preventing it. We've got ports at which it might be arriving. We've got some sort of attenuation that might happen because ports are far away from host material. And then we have the potential of establishment. And that framework there is an example of a model that can be used to talk about the processes. Okay, so these models, as I've mentioned, are ontologies. And this is important because, well, I'll define an ontology now. An ontology is just a collection of things. I'm using without actually, I'll just take a quick step back. Different disciplines use the label ontology differently. I'm going to talk about the particular definition where an ontology is a collection of things and how they relate to each other specifically. So here's a famous ontology that tries to distinguish between different types of pizzas. And we see that we have the root at the top, and then a pizza is depending from the root, and then we have this relationship has topping that connects to the toppings, and then we have different types of pizzas, the veggie pizza and the mushroom pizza, and different types of toppings and blah blah blah. And then the veggie pizza, a particular type of veggie pizza is a margarita, and it involves tomato, mozzarella, etc., etc., etc. I'm not here to debate the definitions of pizzas. I just want to talk about this as an example of thinking crisply, how dare I say, about pizzas. And one of the advantages of this kind of exercise is that it lets you look at what are overlapping definitions, for example, veggie pizzas having veggie toppings or cheese toppings, etc. But also it lets you identify gaps because there are no meat pizzas in this ontology. And that, I think, is a significant oversight. So the ontology is just a way of organizing the information that we have about a system. It's a representation of a system. I have stumbled many times on the idea that we would refer to these as ontologies. So there's a little analogy down there at the bottom. If you're uncomfortable, just read that and feel good. Okay, so where do we go from here? Here's a great example of an ontology that was constructed by our dear friend, Dr. Mike Ormsby from MPI. It's a visual representation of how international travelers engage with the entry, unwittingly, I might add, engage with the potential entry of fruit fly. And we see that we've got this spine of activities going across the middle, and then we have all of the things that feed into those activities, and then we have coloring to express information about those things, and we capture information, crucial information, about this system, specifically about international travelers and fruit fly in this model. So that's another example of an ontology that lets us talk crisply about what we're doing when we're thinking about this thing. And again, creation of this diagram, it's almost it's creating knowledge and detail out of something that, unless you write this down, it's not defined, and it's not delineated, and the relationships aren't sketched out. So you can't talk about the system unless you capture it in some way. And this is the first step towards doing that kind of thing. Here's another example. This is the logic model of the Australian biosecurity system that was created by Edith Arndt and Karen Schneider and a suite of experts many years ago, and still, I think, provides considerable value in terms of thinking about what the biosecurity system is. Because if we stop and take a step back, actually, the biosecurity system arguably might actually be many systems that are sheltering under a single label. They don't all necessarily have the same goal. And that might be an interesting way to think about how we distinguish between systems. Anyway, that's for question time. Okay, so let's press on. Now I'm going to give you an example of how using a model can help us think about a system in a way that informs decision making. And then I'm going to lead into the SPARC from there. So let's imagine this system where we have high risk, fresh produce, fruit fly, border control by an anonymous state. I'm patting myself on the back for packing so many compound adjectives into that title. 3. I bet no one can do better. This risk management system involves intervention. There's an inspection at some point, quite a detailed inspection at some point along the value chain, let's call it. And then there's fumigation at some point along the value chain. And then there's more inspection along the value chain. Specifically, it's 600 unit visual inspection, and 10% of the 600 units are dissected under a magnifier lamp. So the system has a number of components. There are consignments of fresh fruit and vegetables. And there is a subsampling of those consignments for the inspection, that's 600 units. And there's a subsample of those 600 units for further dissection under a magnifying lamp. And we also think about, well, what proportion of the consignments is inspected and how good is the inspection? So these are different components to the system that we want to capture and talk about in some way. So now we're going to go to the algebraic part. So I apologize if anyone's triggered by this. I probably should have put up a trigger warning. We're going to do some, I mean, it's not really algebra, it's just expressions, but I apologize if this is a little much. I want to define the loss that's associated with that pathway as the estimated biosecurity cost from contaminated consignments entering the anonymous state. I'm going to write that the loss is the pathway volume, that's V, multiplied by as the number of consignments, multiplied by the consignment contamination rate, multiplied by whether or not we inspect and whether or not we detect, that's the 1 minus F times S part of the equation, multiplied by the cost of an incursion being detected. And I've got a little footnote down there, a cute little footnote, you know, ignoring the shenanigans that we have to go through because we're thinking about, well, there might be two of these incursions and the second one might cost differently because of the first one, can't kill the same piece of fruit twice, blah, blah, blah. These are, I mean, important considerations, but they're not relevant to this discussion because if you don't like this loss model, you can make another one and it'll just be perfectly fine. So this is my loss model, Andrew's special loss model, and I'm going to use this to talk about the system. So I've captured the components of the system in a model that talks about how they relate to each other, and I've said, let's use this to talk about the loss that we have when that system is operating. Notice that I haven't included the control measures in here, and I've excluded those deliberately. But they are relatively predictable and they can be part of the equation as well. But again, this is my loss model. All right, now I'm going to drop into R and I'm going to calculate the loss for some scenario. So let's imagine we have 20,000 consignments a year coming in on that pathway and we inspect a quarter of them. And let's imagine that if a consignment is contaminated, we detect it with probability 0.6. So 6 times out of 10, we will detect a contaminated consignment. And now furthermore, let's say that the underlying contamination rate is about 2%. And we know that based on 1,000 observations. And that's what this R beta thing is doing. Don't worry about the details. I can explain those in question time or over a glass of wine. It's just saying the BRM rate is 1 in 50, and we know that reasonably well. And let's say that the establishment rate, if a contaminated article gets through the system, is 1 in 1,000. And that's just a rank guess. Okay, so, and then finally, let's say that if there's a detection, then it's going to cost $2 million. And I don't know why there's a pound symbol there. I'm not happy about that. It's definitely $2 million. Okay, so we can capture all this then in an R function. The loss is the volume times the BRM rate times 1 minus whether you inspected and whether you detected times the establishment rate times the cost. That just lines up beautifully. And now we can take the mean of that and we see that the mean loss is about, let's call it $700,000 a year. So what that says then is that according to this model, on average, you would expect the activity on this pathway to cost you $700,000. That's it. So now you know what that pathway is costing you if you believe in all the things that went before. And I want to argue that knowing that, even though the knowledge is conditional, is much more useful than not knowing it. And I can say, well, what's the median loss? The median loss is about $500,000, a little bit less. And what's a high loss? You know, what's an extreme year, like a 1 in 20 year? And the high loss would be $2 million, give or take. So this is again giving us information about the pathway. When we're running the pathway, half the time it'll be below $450,000, half the time it'll be above. On average, it'll be $675,000, and an extreme scenario is $2 million in a year. So you've got to make sure that you're thinking about that in terms of the cost. Sorry, that 2e to the 6 is just $2 million. I put it like that because because I wasn't thinking. Okay, let's keep going. Now I'm going to pause on this graphic, and this is like a nightmare graphic, I know. I want to pause on this because it tells us something really important. It captures the previous information, but in a way that says, what is the probability that loss is less than these numbers of millions of dollars? So it's almost certain that in any given year, the loss will be less than $4 million. That's happy days. We know that it's 95% likely that the loss will be less than $2 million. We can also say it's about 80% likely that the loss will be less than $1 million. So that's telling us something about, in any given year, what the distribution of the loss is going to be. And if we wanted to know, again, if we wanted to read off, well, what's the 0.5, which is the median, we're coming back to the around $450,000. Okay, so this is, I'm going to use this graphic style again in ongoing examples. So I just want to spend a moment to explain what's going on here. The line tells us, we read off the probability that the loss is less than the value expressed on the x-axis. And that's really important. We don't only want to think, and the reason we want to think about this is we don't only want to be thinking about what's the expected loss, because it may well be that there's a chance that the loss could be disastrous. You know, I mean, we said it could be up to $2 million, okay, with a 1 in 20 chance. Well, that's actually pretty informative, because you want to know how much reserve you should have just in case. You don't plan for the expected loss, you plan for some sort of scenario that involves more than the expected loss. Okay, we roll on. So now, how much is the inspection worth? Well, that's an interesting question. What value does that inspection of quarter of the pathway deliver? So we can take the value and we say the counterfactual is we do zero inspection. Okay, so we do zero. So we calculate the loss assuming zero inspection, and then we subtract that from the loss with which is the standard, and it tells us it's worth $120,000. The inspection relative to the deferred incursion of fruit fly only is worth $120,000. And you can then decide, well, is that a good investment? There's now this graph is going to tell us the probability the value is less than these millions of dollars. So the probability the value is worth less than $500,000 is almost certain. The probability the value is less than $200,000 is 0.8. So with very high probability, you're looking at $120,000, $150,000 worth of value from the inspection. And you can ask, how much does the inspection cost? You can put that in a more formal economic framework where you might look at the return on investment of that inspection relative to other things, or if I have to, Tom, the change in relative value relative to other things, and you can compare them and then use that to invest. I'm not going to do all that, rigorous and correct but complicated stuff in this presentation. I'm going to do much more hand waving than I am real economics. I can hear Tom frothing immediately and champing at the bit. So what do we want to observe about this system? Well, firstly, note that when planning for the future, volumes could change or they could stay the same. And here's some examples taken from recent presentations. This is the arrival rate of travellers to Australia. 2015, 2017, 2019, crashed to 2020, 21 because of COVID. So I can assure you that the risk presented to Australia by the traveller pathway changed radically throughout COVID. Here's some recent statistics on Australian imports of fresh fruit and therefore Australian imports on pathways that are frequented by pests that may be regulated. And notice what we've got here is we've got 2020, 21, 22, 23, and 24, and the imports have kind of dropped I'm going to say dropped substantially from 21 to 24, about 40% down. Mostly avocados, a little bit of a drop in citrus, kiwi fruits going strongly, table grapes. Table grapes and avocados are being imported much less frequently. And as a consequence, our fresh fruit imports have dropped. Here's as a counterfactual or counterexample, here are the 20-foot equivalent units handled by stevedores for containers, and the containers are on a pretty regular rise. All of these volumes, therefore, are changing in time, and we should acknowledge that when we're thinking about the performance of our system. So what if the volumes did drop by 40%? What would be the loss associated with that? Here, we've calculated that loss as, let's call it $250,000. So the loss from the system drops sharply. In fact, predictably, it drops to about 0.6 of the previous loss, which is a nice facility because of our model. Of course, it might not be true in models that are more complicated and possibly a better reflection of the actual system. But the point here is not to be rigorously correct. The point is to make an argument. So make it I shall. So, and here we see that the probability that the loss is less than $500,000 is about 0.8. So there's a substantial benefit to the system if the pathway volume drops, which is no surprise at all, but it is a consideration. If you think, for example, that in the future, as you think about the risk presented by pathways going forward, it may behoove you to think about changes in the loss associated, or perhaps the risk associated with the pathway, and how that might change the relative risk across pathways. All right. So now I'm going to say, what about if we want to think about how to manage the pathway, not just watch the volumes change? What if we want to actually make the pathway change? So we could inspect more of the pathway. This would occasion a higher cost of personnel and a slower release of consignments because there may require double handling. Or what if we wanted to increase the sensitivity? We could inspect more than 600 units, or we could cut up more than 10% of the consignment, or we could use a better magnification lamp. Or what if we wanted to invest in trying to decrease the BRM rate? We could create incentives, or we could sharpen punishments, or we could even, dare I say, invest in interjurisdictional collaboration to work across boundaries to say, well, what are the concerns that are creating biosecurity risk at the top end of the supply chain, and how can we invest in those? What should we do? So here's the applied research question, right? So now we're doing this from the point of view of the system. How could we invest? So what is the value, for example, of increasing inspection from 25% to 50%? I'm not going to go through all the painful detail, but I'm going to tell you it's worth $120,000, which is actually kind of cool because that's how much the inspection at 25% was worth in the first place. So we are comforted to note that inspection scales linearly in its value. $120,000 if we increase inspection. Now we know that increasing inspection is going to have knock-on effects and create costs and burdens. We can now ask the question, should we do it relative to other things? What about if we increase the sensitivity, for example, to 80% by increasing the sample size? And forgive me, I didn't go to the point of figuring out how many more samples we'd have to calculate because it doesn't seem important. Let's just imagine that we can sample enough more samples that we get our sensitivity up to 80%. That's worth $40,000. $40,000 to increase sensitivity. That's a proposal. I mean, I'm not a manager, so I'm not in a position to say whether it's good or bad, but it doesn't sound like very much increased value in the value to me. What about if we were to reduce the BRM by 25%? So we can model that, and that's worth $170,000. So that's getting a little bit more valuable. That's getting a little bit more worthwhile. Could we spend $170,000 to reach out to other jurisdictions, or the jurisdictions that are trading to us, and provide them with some support? We'll get the benefit. Okay. Also, though, and this is now we're starting to get close to the core of the presentation. It's taken me a long time, I'm so sorry. We can manage these systems into counterfactual futures. And what do I mean by that? We can think differently about the system. So what about if we invested in new inspection equipment, for example, AI or optical scanning or something like that? It would cost more. There might be faster processing, there might be better sensitivity, and that might occasion lower leakage. Or what if someone came to us with a proposal, right? Research proposal, an applied research proposal that targeted improvements. So we'd have to think about how much the research investment would be. The intervention might cost something different. The process might cost something different. It might be more sensitive. There might be lower leakage, maybe. So now let's think about investment in the system, and let's say, well, we could invest in increasing the number that we inspect. We could invest in more Maggie lamps. We could invest in interjurisdictional support, or we could invest in research. So it's a counterfactual investment. Let's talk about it that way. So what would that look like? Well, we could just extend this project, extend this model to accommodate the possibility of a research outcome. Here I'm saying, let's imagine that our researcher claims that they could get sensitivity up to 0.9. And let's furthermore imagine with some degree of confidence. And furthermore, let's imagine that they think there's a 50% chance it's going to work. I know. It's crazy to think about research that way, isn't it? It gives a benefit and there's a probability you succeed. It's so reductionist. But there, my dear friends, in its reductionist nature lies its extraordinary appeal, is that this provides us with a first order way of thinking about an unknown counterfactual, such as let's invest in some research in the same framework that we could use to invest in anything else that we might do to manage the program. So the mean here for the research, the return on investment here is $30,000. So we could invest, if we invest $30,000, then we get, sorry. That's the annual return. The annual return is $30,000. So we need to think about how we think about that going forward in time. And we may need to, dare I say it, discount this return in some way. But there is a return, it is calculable, and we can, again, compare it to the cost of doing that research this year. There's the return curve. I'm going to skip over that because I'm short on time, parlously. What if that sensor also reduced the BRM rate? Now, one way it might do that is that you might make a big hullabaloo about introducing a new sensor on the pathway. And the stakeholders might say, oh, crumbs, we really need to lift our game because, you know, the regulator's bringing out the big gun. And maybe they then invest in their own risk reduction infrastructure. Now then, the value of that research becomes, and I just made this up, of course, $185,000 a year. That's a substantial uptick. So this corollary of the idea that we thought about in the research space, this sort of social influence of the research, also has its impact, and it turns out that the social impact of the research dwarfs the value in terms of the reduced leakage. And I think this is really worth thinking about. Is as a side note, it's really worth thinking about what influence does our intervention at the border have on stakeholder behavior, and how do we signal that in a way that ensures that stakeholder behavior reflects the risk appropriately? There's an interesting sort of thought experiment in there that has been subject to some CEBRA scrutiny in the past. Anyway, I leave that as a tantalizing footnote. So now, finally, I get to the point, SPARC, which is our uncomfortably Procrustean acronym. I want to emphasize that this sort of suite of steps is for an applied research program. And the reason I'm really emphasizing this applied research program is because I want to think about an applied research program as being a program where the counterfactual is you can invest in things that you do. You can invest in things that impact your activities. So the reason that we're focusing on this as being an applied research program is that the goal is the system has an outcome. The system has as a desired outcome, and the system manager is obliged to manage the system in the best possible way. And research is one among a number of investments that the manager can make. And I want to put that investment on a common footing with the other things that the organization could do. So this is not something where you put it up in front of the ARC and say, oh, let's talk about the value of research to the ARC. No. But would you put it in front of a regulator that had a system to manage? Yes. So in brief, you build a value model that talks about the loss or the value or anything that, and in any dimension that that the system requires. So in the case I showed you there, I talked about the loss that it was occasioned by pathway activity, but you could talk about the value of a system, and you could talk about it not merely financially, but you could talk about non-market values as well. All of these are in scope. You test that model, and I say etc. because you test it and you test it again, and you keep testing it. Testing it with the stakeholders, testing it with the decision makers. Use scenarios, use data, use everything. You get the value estimates and you exploit those ruthlessly. So you tell people the inspection is worth this much, as long as it's worth a lot. You tell people our investments are worth a lot, and you show them the evidence that they're worth a lot. And then you can use that model to simulate and develop a budget of uncertainty that tells you, if I wanted to know something more about the system, where would my best investment be? Where would I invest to decrease my uncertainty so that the probability of extreme uncertainty affecting me is reduced? You can then use the model as an ontology to classify research proposals and even research products. The model itself organizes everything that you're doing that is relevant to it, and including organizing out things that are not relevant. You can identify gaps and overlaps, and you can then take proposals and you can map them to the model, and eliciting, using structured expert judgment, any other information you need. So what do I mean by that? Well, I just talked about it. We just said, well, what about a proposal to work on a new IR sensor, infrared sensor that might do better at detecting fruit fly? Well, what part of the model, what part of the system would that piece of research impact? It would change the sensitivity of border inspection. Well, we can capture the sensitivity of the border inspection in our model. We already do. So we can capture the change in our model, and we can say, what's the value of the proposed change to the system? And then we can say, what's the probability that it's going to work? And we can simulate all these things. And that lets us say all of the research proposals can be essentially not only costed, but also valued as applied research proposals by using this model. We can simulate the research impacts as we did earlier, and then we can obtain the expected value of the research investment, or we can obtain the full probability model if that is of interest. And then we can take the model and plug it into an optimizer and uncover fresh priorities. So the model then informs an end-to-end approach as to how to improve the system, including allowing for research proposals and valuing those research proposals. That's the proposal I'm putting in front of you today. It's been kicking around in my head. Now, there are some curious wrinkles associated with this. Now, the first one is, how would you review those proposals? There's a really interesting challenge, because each proposal now is accompanied by a probability of success and an expected benefit, or maybe even a full distribution of benefit. Well, I'd like to suggest that those could be reviewed using a structured expert judgment process. I haven't really thought through the wrinkles in my head, but you could get a team of reviewers whose job it would be to review the text of a proposal and then come up with a probability of success and a expected value, and that those could then be used combined with in some weighted way with the proposer's values to assess the utility of the research. So there'd be and honestly, I think that would be better than what we do right now, because what we do right now is very distressingly hand-wavy. We could also use the model to handle exclusions. Now, this is where we might be stepping into some controversial territory, because the question that springs to everyone's mind, of course, is, well, what if you can't cleanly map the research to the value model? That's a very interesting question. The implications are a little unsettling. That might suggest, for example, that the research doesn't directly provide value to the system. And in an applied research program, maybe it doesn't belong. I know, that's a terrible thing to say. We should be open-handed. We should invite all and welcome all research ideas. No, we shouldn't. Not for an applied research program. An applied research program works to an agenda. And so if your model doesn't capture a research idea, then either the model is inadequate, and that's perfectly possible, or the research is irrelevant. So that's an intriguing lens, and I'm looking forward to picking up that in the discussion. It also creates accountability, because when people put these proposals forward, they'll have a record of proposals and funds and these sorts of things, and indeed the reviewers also will have a record, a quantitative record, that can then be used going forward in time to assess the honesty of researchers and the perspicacity of reviewers. And finally, the approach will provide a mechanism for handling uncertainty. And this is a double-edged sword, right? Because the mechanism will provide great value to interpreting system behavior, but also it imposes upon the system managers essentially a challenge that they need to understand uncertainty and how uncertainty engages with their system. And that's not necessarily trivial. So that's going to require an uplift in system executive thinking. So to sum up then, this approach solves three big problems. The three big problems it solves are, firstly, thinking about a system just as a system and thinking about it and being able to talk about it and being able to communicate it. It solves the problem of how to value the system, how to say how much the system's worth. And thirdly, it solves the problem of how to think systematically about the value of different proposals of things to do to the system to enhance its outcomes, including applied research proposals. And on that note, I will say that models are awesome and we should make more of them. And I will now stop sharing and invite questions. I hope.
Just while people are gathering their thoughts, thank you so much, Andrew. I do note there is a question in the chat around probability of research being taken up, which we know is not quite the same as probability of the research being successful in and of itself. Do you have any thoughts there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Nari, that's a great question. Thank you so much. We could, I could add another term to the model, and that would be probability of research uptake. Or you could embed that in the estimation of the probability of the research success. So there's a couple of, and you might want to tease those apart, or you might want to, I think teasing those apart makes sense. So sure, of course we can. It's a great idea. Thank you.
Just building on that, Andrew, it would also be nice to have a time frame in there of time frame of uptake and time frame of impact. But I know that you've already thought of that.
No, I hadn't. You are indeed right. No. This is I've come here expecting to be hounded or at least schooled, and so no. Absolutely, a time frame is useful to think about to make this even crisper. But I agree with you. Yes, yeah. Okay, I see Tom's question. Don't we care about incremental value of measures taken on the system, the incremental value of research itself? Well, I know, Tom. Why don't you sell it to me?
Well, we care about rate of return, right?
Oh.
So if we're
Oh, Look, I handled your shenanigans, okay? I said shenanigans.
I can't help myself, Andrew.
That's like a placeholder for Tom and for Aaron and for all of you guys who are totally technically correct. I agree, but please, can we talk about the simple version first? But I agree with you, of course.
I love the presentation, the ontologies. It's a brilliant point. I'll let John Keane come in. He's got a question.
So John, so there's I can imagine systems being that large and complex. One might naively say that the biosecurity system is too large and complex to capture all the subtleties in the model that can be agreed on. I think what it comes down to is the juxtaposition of creativity and ruthlessness. I think we have to, at some level, we have to simplify things so that they can be thought of, because otherwise management happens in chaos. And so if a system is so large that it can't be modeled, then I think the system has to be, I think there has to be some dissection taken. Otherwise, the thing here for me is that the counterfactual is that otherwise we do nothing. So I want to argue that even if the system is very complicated and tricky and difficult, building a model that represents it is going to be better than sacrificing a goose and examining its entrails on the altar of Odin, because that's the only other thing you've got. If it's so big and complex that you can't think of it, then simplify or die. Let that be my watchword.
We'll have a few more minutes if people have other questions. I think an interesting point here, Andrew, is the corollaries with economic modelling, which, as we know, faces that same issue, that the world is too complex to model, but there is still value in doing so anyway, as long as one is aware of the limitations. So that might be another point, is to articulate consciously what the limitations are. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Julia, it's a great point. Thank you for that. There's two sides to that, actually. On the one hand, you're exactly right that articulating the shortcomings of a model as a representation of a system has incredible value at helping the decision makers have an appropriate, suitable distance from the model, so that they can, and decision makers, in my experience, are very good at contextualizing as long as they understand what the context is, they can use that context to modify their decision. That's very important. But the second part about it is, we tend to, when we're talking about simplifications, we tend to conflate the model accuracy with the model quality. And we tend to think about models as representations of reality. And while that's an attractive lens, it's not actually what an applied research program is supposed to do. It's not about discovering the truth about a system. It's about helping a good decision be made. So I think the thread that I want to follow here is that a model being used to make decisions needs to help good decisions be made. It doesn't matter if that model has shortcomings that would invalidate it as a representation of the truth. So which provides us with a safety net while still acknowledging the importance of your point, acknowledge shortcomings for sure, but also recognize that we want to make the model, the purpose of the model is to make decisions, not to represent the world. And in this, I'm actually leaning on 20 years of experience with the Department of Agriculture, which I came in as a statistician, all gung-ho to use statistics to uncover the truth, whereas what the department wanted to do was use statistics to uncover good decisions. And although those things intersect in some places, they're not the same. And if we as service providers get bound up in the idea of finding out what the truth is, then we'll get the answer wrong in terms of delivering intelligence that provides better decision making. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox right now, but yeah. So my short answer to your comment is yes, absolutely, and also.
Do you want to pick up some of the other questions that are in the chat around the value of not doing research?
So that's a curious counterfactual, JK. I'm going to say that the model doesn't lend itself naturally within my imagination to that question, because I think you need to, unless you can say, well, what is the potential value of research? And then the counterfactual becomes we don't do that potential thing. I mean, you could look at the value of historical research, just in the same way as you could look at the value of historical intervention, and say history suggests that research has the potential to shift the dial this way or that. I mean, it's a risky proposition, though, to say we're just going to throw $500,000 into a research pool because we think it might help. Compared to, oh, well, $500,000 will certainly shift the dial somewhere else. I suppose there might be a way of looking at it that way when we try to sort of have a generic research value. I don't know what it would look like, though, and I'm loath to try to speculate in the moment. So I'm just going to say, sure. Anka, great idea. Thank you very much. Nari, JK's point, models also help us identify, yes, absolutely. We can drill down, and I'm going to scroll back to see if I can find Alex's question. Yes, to prioritize areas of the system, yes. So Alex Murray rightly asks, could we use this model to prioritize areas of the system to think about or to dissect? And the answer is certainly could. That's a great idea. Great suggestion.
That's fantastic. So just a last call if there's any questions. I know we're coming right up on time though. And we do certainly appreciate. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to take the opportunity to display my my waistcoat. One of my naughtier CEBRA research persons suggested I looked like a Christmas tree bauble. I don't know what to do with that except lean into it. So hang me on your tree, folks.
It does appear to have something on it relating to plants, so it's kind of on theme. Is that the connection?
Absolutely. It's got a number of. It's got some leaves and some blossoms, and some various other things. Yes, that I can't quite recognise.
Excellent. Well, you came for the insights and you left with the fashion tips. So just a huge thank you, Andrew, for taking us through that. And I think really for me, and I hope for others on the call today, it was really about extending our thinking and getting us to step back from our work, both from engaging with models, which is a part of a lot of people's work, but also then thinking about research and how we think about that, and perhaps where we can think more systematically about the value of upcoming research. And I think personally, from my perspective, the value of a research portfolio and how it could be assessed against something quite concrete. So it's quite exciting, I think, to look into. But thank you again, Andrew, really value your contributions. As I mentioned, this recording will be up on our YouTube channel shortly, and we will also let you know very soon about when our next CEBRAnar will be on, so keep an eye out for it. But thanks again, everyone, for all your engagement, and I hope you all have a really good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.